Good.
Hello and welcome to those who have arrived a moment early. We will get started right on time at noon, and thank you for being here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a moment. I'm Laura Simoes from the Naki S. Loeb School of Communications, and just delighted to have you with us. Today, during the webinar, you are able to interact and ask questions in the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of your screen. You should also be able to see a chat button, and there you will be receiving links to resources that will be posted throughout the session. At the end of the session, we will be back in touch with you. I'm going to turn everything over now to Melanie to welcome you and tell you more about today's program. Melanie, could I get you to unmute, please?
Well, sure. Thank you, Laura. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Plenda. I'm the Executive Director of the Granite State News Collaborative. I want to welcome everyone to our first Lunch and Learn, and I also want to say a big thank you to our Lunch and Learn series partner, Laura Simoes at the Naki S. Loeb School of Communications. As journalists, we often have to cover difficult topics where we need to get information out to the public, but do so in a way that is responsible and in service to the community. So today we'll hear from Elaine DeMello, Director of Suicide Prevention Services at NAMI, New Hampshire, retired Major Russ Conti, Chair of New Hampshire Suicide Prevention Council, Mary Forsyth Tabor, Co-Chair of the New Hampshire Suicide Prevention Council, and Kim Murdoch, Director of Communications at NAMI, New Hampshire, who will provide us with some insights on suicide and media coverage, as well as tips to consider when we cover suicide. So the first half of our workshop will be a presentation from NAMI, followed by roughly 30 minutes of Q&A, but please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. And as Laura mentioned, following the workshop, you'll each receive a reporter tip sheet, a recording of the workshop to share with your newsrooms, and a survey seeking input on other topics we may want to cover in future Lunch and Learn sessions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists.
So this is Elaine DeMello. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Melanie and Laura for coordinating and working with us on this. I am the Director of Suicide Prevention Services at NAMI, New Hampshire, and I've worked in the mental health field for about 45 years, with probably the last half of that being in the field of suicide prevention. What we wanted to cover with you today is looking at some of the dynamics that occur with suicide risk and how media can influence that, how communication and messaging can influence that. We certainly have known for a long time that media and messaging and communication can influence behavior. And that certainly is true when it comes to suicide risk, suicide thinking, and even suicide behavior. So some of the strategies that allow us to direct people to help and hope could be through those mechanisms of communication. And so we wanted to look at some of the dynamics, give you a number of examples and some illustrations, and then look at strategies and some of the partnerships that have been developed and that we hope will continue to develop. So as part of that, the team and folks that are with me today include people who, as were introduced, have a lot of experience with law enforcement, with public health, with mental health, and with suicide prevention, and also are actively involved and have been for quite a while with the New Hampshire Suicide Prevention Council. So during the Q&A, I encourage you to offer questions, comments, and tap into the expertise that is here. Just wanted to preface this by saying that we know that suicide is a profound loss. Perhaps all of us have been touched by some kind of loss, and even by a suicide loss at some point. Talking about this topic can bring up personal experiences and emotions for us. I just want to be sensitive to that. and so that we want you to take good care of yourselves throughout this topic and afterwards. We also are very cognizant of the fact that media can have very high exposure to trauma. You are on the scene not long after the first responders are there. You're very involved and engaged in that scene. And so we recognize that you may have your own history or current experiences with vicarious trauma. So once again, please take good care. Seek, support if you need to. Afterwards, feel free to reach out to any of us or the 24/7 numbers that we all continue to promote. So the dynamics around suicide prevention and contagion, and we've learned this over the years through research, through experience, is that exposure to a suicide can influence others who are already at risk to think about taking their own life or attempting suicide. And we know that knowing someone who has died by suicide is one of the most significant risk factors for that person to attempt or die by suicide. And that doesn't have to be a personal relationship. It certainly can be through the media, which we've learned, which is why this particular topic is so important. Who is that vulnerable audience? It could be teens and young adults who are very impressionable. Brains are still developing. It certainly could also be others who have attempted suicide or who are affected by mental health or substance misuse conditions, all of whom are at risk for contagion. And so media in particular, when it goes out to the public without a context or without knowing who is the recipient of that information, can be very influential, especially when it's unsafe or repeatedly promotes some things that could increase risk for people. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those are and what the kind of where we want to promote certain ways of messaging and avoid other ways of messaging. And that's why throughout the work that we do, one really key piece that we do is being mindful of how we are all communicating, not just through media, but how we're guiding messaging throughout our communities. And this is not just here in New Hampshire, this is based on national practices, research, and studies. So over the years, we compiled some headlines just to give you some ideas of what examples might look like. And these go way back. These are 15 years old and more. But on the harmful side, the man dies in grisly suicide was an article that came out. That was the headline. The article went into extensive detail about how this man died by suicide. What was most concerning was at the end of that article was a little note that said, and if you'd like to try this yourself, here's a website that you can go to. And of course, we were all quite upset and concerned about what kind of information had now been conveyed to the general public, some of whom, as we know, could be very high risk and are reading this article because they're drawn to it. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of work that went into not just the work with the media way back when, 15 years ago, but also with first responders who were on the scene who may have shared some of the details that went into this article. Second example, some colleges expel suicidal students. That's a headline that says to a student in college who's considering suicide that you better not tell anybody because the consequences will be, perhaps losing your opportunity to continue in college. Again, just sort of what's the messaging behind the message here. The KSC student shoots classmate, kills self. Again, it was a very big, very broad, bold headline. And again, pretty dramatic situation, but it identified a location, drew attention to the drama. This is again, a group campus that is housing, like many all campuses do, very vulnerable young adults. And so again, if there had been a different way to report that, that would have been preferred. And then suicide spike in the spring. It was a really good article written by a psychologist in New Hampshire, but the headline kind of did that little bit of sensational piece and got our attention, but also increased the message that, bad things are happening and we may not be able to do anything about it. It just creates that sense of potential helplessness or hopelessness. So what we find to be helpful is things that report on positive things happening in our communities, ways to get information on how to address conditions like depression, or resources that are available, such as the group supports suicide loss survivors. So I'm going to look at a couple of national examples, and there's lots of research about how media has been portrayed over the years, how media has portrayed different incidents over the years and what kind of outcomes have occurred. I'll talk more after this about New Hampshire examples, but we certainly know one of the most famous ones, of course, was Marilyn Monroe, who was incredibly glamorized in her life and certainly glamorized in her death. And this is before we had social media, before we had electronic media, but all of the coverage that came out after her death directly was associated with an increase in suicides within a month after her death that were believed to be directly related because the method was the same. There was a lot of other indicators that said it was influenced by her death and all of the coverage of her death. And that equated to about 200 people. But we've looked at other situations over the years. And one interesting one was that when Kurt Cobain took his life, there was a lot of concerns that he had a very vulnerable following of fans. And there was concern that there would be a spike in suicide deaths after his death. And it did get extensive media coverage, but not quite in the same way. There was not a lot of glamorizing. His wife and his mother denounced his death publicly, and we didn't see any statistically significant increase in suicides, much to the relief of suicide prevention experts in the field. And you'll notice that this Rolling Stone article, yes, they had to report on it, and they did, but they didn't do anything different with his cover than they would with any other celebrity death. They put his name, date of birth, date of death, no big flashy sign that says suicide, nothing like that. So we think all of those dynamics may have changed the outcome in terms of the not a visible outcome of contagion following his death. So the media recommendations are something we will share with you. We're going to put some links and resources in this webinar and in the chat box. But this is what they look like on the media recommendations. These have been developed by national experts, and they have been available for quite a while now based on the research, and they're the do's and don'ts. I realize it's hard to read them, but we also have safe messaging guidelines that follow those. So it's really for everyone. It's not just for media to follow, but it's also for the general public, for people who are working in the prevention field to guide safe messaging for all of us, because we can influence it on a one-to-one level as well as we can in a larger scale. And I will just mention that the media recommendations have been adopted by Poynter as well, so you can find them there. So what do they recommend? The media guidelines? Well, always post information on where and how to get help. And certainly in New Hampshire now, we have New Hampshire Rapid Response. Nationally, we have 988. We also want to educate people about what to look for if somebody is demonstrating warning signs, just like we would with a heart attack. If people know what to do and they see what somebody is exhibiting, the likelihood of us responding more quickly and getting a good outcome is something that we want to educate people on. We also want to reduce stigma, promote people getting help for mental health and substance use, and knowing that treatment can be effective. We want to promote local efforts that are working to prevent suicide. There's a lot that the New Hampshire SPC, Suicide Prevention Council, does. And so we want to utilize those mechanisms to get the word out about what people are doing and can be doing to prevent suicide. And I'll mention some of the others in just a moment, but what we want to avoid in our messaging and our communication and our headlines or our reporting is detailed descriptions of a suicide incident, just like that one about the grisly suicide. We don't want to be giving people instructions on how to take your life. We want to avoid repeated, prominent, or sensational coverage. I was listening to a report this morning about the Boston Marathon and the bombings and how people are still having flashbacks from that repeated coverage. So at minimum, it could traumatize people, but it's certainly in the mind of somebody who's preoccupied with dying. It can really start to saturate their thinking, which can be very distorted and sometimes very unhealthy, to the point where they become consumed with focusing on suicide rather than focusing on getting help. In some cases, if a person is made to look like a saint or celebrity, or their death is elevated over their life, that can be appealing to some people. I think of young people in school who say, well, nobody notices me while I'm alive, but look at all the attention this person gets. You know, they get a big picture in the yearbook, or they get, you know, a front page story if they kill themselves. Those kinds of things can really change the equation in terms of how a vulnerable person might perceive the value of taking their own lives. When we oversimplify causes without a context, we've heard some people say, well, suicide is an epidemic. I think we really need to make sure that we have our facts straight, and we're not just using that term because it can create a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, or it can normalize and make it sound like everybody's doing this and there's nothing we can do about it. So again, those kinds of messages can be provocative and unnecessarily not based in facts. So I'm sorry, that's overstating the frequency of suicide, and oversimplifying causes ties into saying, well, the person was bullied, so they killed themselves. And we know a lot of people are bullied and they don't necessarily take their lives, or somebody loses their job, and doesn't take their life. So we don't want to make an assumption that something happens to somebody, then they die, because again, it normalizes that this is what people do when something bad happens to you. It doesn't create a sense of hope. It creates an avenue for looking at suicide as an option. So I'm going to move on to the terms because we're going to cover that a little bit more here. But overall, in the mental health, substance misuse, and suicide prevention field, we want to reduce stigma and we want to move towards more neutralized terms and look at some of these things as medical conditions, but they are people with these conditions. So on the left-hand side, a person with mental illness is preferred to say the mentally ill, just like we wouldn't say, oh, there's that diabetic. We say, oh, that person happens to have diabetes. They also happen to be a parent. They happen to be, my coworker. We don't say, okay, the mentally ill, because we want to reference them and give them the profile of being a person who has strengths and other things going for them. So they might live with schizophrenia, but they're not a schizophrenic. They may have a substance misuse disorder, but we want to avoid a term like they're an addict or an alcoholic. And then when we get into, again, these are to reduce stigma. When we get into the terms around suicide, we want to be factual. We want to be neutral. We want to say died by suicide or took their own life. The terms on the right sometimes get used. Committed suicide is very commonly used, but again, connotations are we commit crimes, we commit sins, we get committed to the state hospital. It would be preferred if we just said something neutral. We don't commit cancer, we don't commit heart disease, we just say we died by them. So avoiding that is preferred. Successful suicide, we think of that as an oxymoron because it's not a success if the person died by suicide. I don't hear that one so much anymore, but again, we would want to avoid that. We would just say, again, died by suicide. Sometimes people would say chose to kill himself, and many family members will say that was not a choice. They were not in their right mind. They would not have done that if they were thinking clearly. And then we prefer mental health to behavioral health because mental health really represents that it's a brain condition, not a behavioral condition. So again, these terms, as we use them in our day-to-day language, as we use them in our public messaging, can really make a difference in terms of shaping how people think about folks who have been affected by mental health, substance misuse, and suicide. So here's some New Hampshire examples, and I want to start with this one. We have done a lot of work. Of course, Robin Williams' death was a number of years ago now, but we had done a lot of work in New Hampshire, working with the media, training people about the safe messaging and the media recommendations. And something really amazing happened when Robin Williams died. I got a lot of phone calls from reporters all around the state. And I spent pretty much, a good part of the day on the phone because they were saying, look, this is big. We have to report on it, but we want to do it responsibly and we want to do it sensitively. Can you help us with this? So I was helping to craft messages, getting information out there, getting resources out there. And unbeknownst to me, reporters at local levels were contacting people, partners around the state, people in mental health and people in public health and prevention fields, who also were quite well aware of what the guidelines are. And they were also giving information and guiding reporting at the local level. So at the end of the day, we had a number of articles that came out of New Hampshire that didn't look like a lot of the national headlines. The national headlines were reporting on his method, what he did, the details, the grisly stuff, the sensational stuff, the dramatic stuff. And what we saw in New Hampshire were these are just samples of some of the headlines. It's about understanding mental illness can affect anybody. There's help that available, understanding how we can learn more about this and be more sensitive to helping people get help when they need it. So that's just sort of a sample of some of the work that's been done in New Hampshire that really happened quite spontaneously, but it happened quite cohesively. And it's really, we were all proud to see New Hampshire's response to this necessity of reporting on it. But the partnership was, you called us and we were there, and you asked for guidance, we provided it, and we had a collaborative effort in terms of getting information out at a really critical time. Some other really key partners, as we mentioned earlier, we've worked with first responders and law enforcement to understand what information is helpful or not helpful at the time of a high profile incident. And in this case, we had done a lot of work with this police department around suicide prevention and postvention. And not too long after that, this article came out, and I provide the excerpts here, where clearly a man was attempting suicide in a public area. So of course, there's going to be publicity, there's going to be reporting on it. And the line that says, investigators were found with a man who was believed to be self-inflicted injuries. Clearly, the reporter was trying to get more information about the weapon, about the method, about what the person was doing. And the sergeant who responded did not get into any detail about it. What he said was, and quote in the paper, "We don't know what he had, but he said now he's in the right place where he can get some help." And so this person's life was saved. The article did not go into details about what he was doing. It turned that corner and said he's getting help. Message being, if you need help, you can get help as well. And the reporter put the 24/7 number at the bottom of that article, which was right where it needed to be. We have partners all around the state, many of them represented here today. So there are folks working in prevention who've been educated around suicide prevention and postvention, and this article came out after a suicide death. So a very high profile, high impact suicide death. And the message was, we don't need to get into the details about what happened or the drama about the incident itself. What we can do is use this as an opportunity to share resources and show people how we can help them through their healing process and get them into the resources and support groups that are available, the network that's available. So once again, the article closed with direct resources and numbers. Another example, again, we had outreach from NHPR when 13 Reasons Why was such a big Netflix series. Some of you may remember, it was about a fictional story about a teenage girl who died by suicide. And then it went on to talk about all of the power that she had over people, basically making suicide look pretty influential, but pretty powerful, that, there's a lot you can do after you kill yourself to influence and gain notoriety through your death. And so there was a lot of concern and in fact, research and evidence that there were teenage girls attempting and dying by suicide with the direct relationship to this Netflix series. New Hampshire Public Radio, very appropriately wanted to do a talk show on it to get some information out there. And what they said they called me and said, "Can you find us a parent of a teenager who lost a teenager to suicide to be on our talk show?" So we spoke about it for a moment, and I said we could, because we work with a lot of parents who've tragically lost their child to suicide. But I think the public story that we'd rather get out there is, let me find you a parent who had a teenager who had attempted suicide, was very much at risk, and is now doing well. And let's get that story out there instead. And so I reached out to a mom who I had worked closely with when her daughter was in high school. The daughter had actually missed some time in high school because of her suicidal attempt, recovered, graduated from high school. And when I called the mom, she said, "Oh, my daughter just graduated with high honors from college. Let me see if she'll be on the show with me." And so the two of them, along with the school psychologist, were on the show. And the message was about, yes, this happens. Yes, these things occur. Teenage life is sometimes very chaotic and sometimes even high risk, but there's things we can do to get through it. And here's a positive outcome. Just one more story about some local reporting and examples of how this, again, can get shaped. The lieutenant in one of our police departments got a call from a reporter who said, I just read this article, this was years ago, that the CDC says suicide rates are on the rise, and I want to do an article on it. Can you tell me what's going on with suicide rates in our community? And the lieutenant, who had been through a lot of training with us, said, well, I don't know if that's the way we want the headline to read. He said, we're doing a lot of work in suicide prevention in our community. How about if you come to a media training that we're offering next week and then work with us to craft an article? So that's what happened. The article turned out to be all about what the community is doing, where and how to get help, what some of the suicide prevention initiatives are. And embedded in that article, it said CDC says suicide rates are on the rise, but in our community, this is what we're doing to address it. And, I asked the lieutenant, I said, if you had not been through training around media and safe messaging, what would have happened when you get that call from the reporter? And he said, probably would have given him lots of data and some stories to go along with it about people who died by suicide. And I realized that's not the way we want to send a message out to the public, because it really is influential in the health and safety of our citizens. So what are some of the strategies that we can consider for working together on suicide prevention? We would love to get the media guidelines out there and ask for your help in doing that. I've worked with some media outlets that have taken the media guidelines and embedded them into training and orientation for every journalist who comes through, comes into the organization. And then just having that opportunity, which we certainly have, those routine articles, wellness columns, health columns, where we can continue to promote suicide prevention and mental health resources so that we can saturate the public consumption with the information that we want them to have. Absolutely, if we can put 24/7 numbers on all reporting on suicide at the bottom. I mean, I had some reporters I worked with actually put a sidebar that would have a template, a sidebar that have the warning signs, and then the 24/7 numbers at the bottom. That we would hope would be in every article, because some people are reading them because they are thinking about their own death, and that might be the time that we catch them. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. We can collaborate to highlight local suicide prevention efforts. We can give you those stories. We can give you stories of people who have been through suicidal incidents and attempts and have recovered. Very, very positive and very inspiring stories. We can talk with you about who the contact people are to reach out to if you do have questions, or you want to get some guidance or information on how to craft a message, either in the moment or certainly on a more planned kind of basis. And then representatives here from the Suicide Prevention Council include the chair of the Suicide Prevention Communications Committee and NAMI New Hampshire, who are all very invested and interested and dedicated to the suicide prevention through the many different partners that we have. So some interesting dynamics about people who are at risk for suicide. We know now that people do get into a very dark path. They start to become consumed with thinking about their own death if they are suicidal, some of them. And some of that can be fueled by some things that input that they get from their social environment and certainly from media. We also know that they're ambivalent. Most people who want to die also want to live. There's a part of them that wants to live. And so there's an opportunity there to be able to catch them in the moment where they're still considering whether they want to live or die, and put something in front of them that might change a lethal outcome. And that sometimes is just the telephone number for 988. So if they see that at the end of an article about suicide, they may call. You probably have noticed, if you've been in places where there's high bridges and places where people have taken their lives, wherever possible, we put out phone numbers, signs, telephones, anything that we can do to kind of catch somebody on that trajectory and try to help them turn that corner so that they make the call. And people make the call from bridges, and so that we know that it worked. I'll give you just another example in a moment, but people are very high risk for suicide, but it's usually for a short period of time. It also can be highly impulsive. So we want to catch them in that moment, and we want to be able to give them a resource or an alternative, which actually can be very effective. And we have partnerships not only with local media and national media, but also with social media entities around the world. And if any of you have gone in to try to search for anything related to suicide, you might notice that you immediately get redirected to 988 and to the information that you see down on the right here. That's because we know that there is that short window of time we may be able to get somebody's attention. They're looking for something, we give them something different, and they may just make a change in their plan. I was at a meeting this morning where somebody who runs the from Headrest, who runs the hotline that answers the 988 calls in New Hampshire, said he got a call just the other day where somebody said, well, I was out searching for ways to kill myself online, and every time I put it in, it directed me to this number. So I decided maybe I should call this number. And what we also know about people who are suicidal or who attempt suicide, 90% of them do not go on to die by suicide. So if we can save that life in that moment, there's a good chance we're going to stay, that crisis is going to stabilize. They're going to come down and back into a better place and not eventually go on to die by suicide. So we value and appreciate the power of the work that you do and the power of the media and communication in our work with prevention. And we are really grateful to you being here and hope that we can continue some dialogue and partnerships about working together to save lives and improve the health and the well-being of people in our communities. So with that, I think we will, right on the button, 12:30, we will open it up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for your presentation. We do have some questions that have come in. I'll be moderating the questions. As a reminder to folks who are on the call, feel free to also add your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If for some reason that's not working for you, please also feel free to use chat, and you can direct that chat to me, Laura Simoes, and the Loeb School, or you can present it for everyone. The first question that I have here, and I'll open this up to our other presenters, Mary and Russ, if you would prefer to ask. We often have to, if you prefer to answer, excuse me, we often have to include details in news stories that we write. How, where, when, what was the situation? So how do you recommend we balance those journalistic standards with avoiding including details on suicide?
Well, I'm happy to answer that. So first off, thanks for having me, and Elaine, thanks for the wonderful job that you did explaining it. I could tell you that for many, many years, and more than one job that I've had in law enforcement, I was involved in screening those requests, and also involved in seeing, the aftermath. And the one thing I always said, and I still say, is, journalists have to do their job. And I think we were not doing our part in training our people on what they need to know. And I think that's been the big change. So I think the balance that needs to happen is between both parties, because I completely understand that the public has a right to know when these incidents happen. What are the circumstances? You have a responsibility to report that as accurately and truthfully as you can. So I think it's a balance between the two. And I hope what we find now is a changeover, because we have so much training for mental health now for first responders. And, we're currently doing a CIT, crisis intervention team program right now this week. And we're turning out police officers now, and we talk about this during the week. We talk about reporting, we talk about understanding better suicide. And I think their understanding of the circumstances better will help you. So we're hoping that we are making big strides in that. And I think the balance that has to be cut here is the police need to understand what your responsibilities are. And then you need to certainly have law enforcement officers that are schooled, so that you're not getting quotes that are inappropriate, or you're not getting somebody that doesn't understand, which is going to, in my view, is going to put you in a bad spot. So that's what we're trying to work. I hope that answers part of the question, but I just wanted you to know how much is being done on the law enforcement side that, frankly, we should have done a long time ago. So, and we really appreciate always the collaborative effort. And personally, yeah, the media has always been, extremely helpful in what we've been trying to do in law enforcement.
Thank you, Russ. Another question is, do the data indicate any recent trends in suicide in New Hampshire and in New England?
I'm happy to try to answer that. We look at data in almost real time where we have it readily available to us. Surprisingly, there was no increase in suicide deaths. And in fact, there was a slight decrease over the years that we dealt with the pandemic. We're not seeing, we don't know that a trend like that would necessarily continue, that we'd see a decline, but we have not seen an increase. What we have seen is we've seen an increase in suicide attempts, particularly of younger people and females, teenagers. The other thing that we have seen, though, that we hope is a result of all the work that we've all been doing, is we've seen a significant uptick in calls to helplines and people in the 988 and New Hampshire Rapid Response. So the trends that we have seen, for the most part, are going in the direction that we would hope, and we would like to think that our prevention efforts are part of the reason that's happening.
Thank you. I think I'm going to throw this one to Mary from for a community perspective as well. Often when someone dies in the community, we will write stories on that person to honor them. What's a way that we can do that with suicides that won't glamorize the death? And also, within the community, are there voices that we should be including in our stories that will really help for readers to understand the impact of that person's death?
Sure. So that's a lot. that's a big question. I do think that I think one of the quotes in the slide deck indicated that there is a ripple effect when someone dies by suicide, whether it's in the public eye or not. And so I think that we need to be really conscious of that and aware of that. And there can be positive ripple effects too, where people reach out to get help. And like Elaine just went through with the 988 and the rapid response, those numbers are ticking up in New Hampshire, which is really good. It means that the communication about them is getting out, and also that is working for people. And so I think if media needs to do anything, it just needs to emphasize that. And then to honor people, I mean, that's really a tricky thing, right? Because we don't want to have memorials set up or have, a lot of different things. When young people die by suicide, a lot of their peers want to take action. There's all kinds of stories about that. I think if there can be a positive prevention-based direction, that's good. NAMI, AFSP, Connors Climb, they all have runs to honor people. I think that those types of things could be mentioned, but I think really paying attention to what some families now are very open about it and want to share that and want people to get help and want them to know about the mental health crisis lines are available. So I think you have to take a cue from the family as well, and honor that and just be really conscious of that. And it's not just the family, that ripple effect goes out to the community. It goes out to where that person might have been working or playing or going to school. And so just to be really careful about that. Media has a lot of power, and they can use that power for good to remind people that there is help and there is hope, and that the family and those that are grieving need some space.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to add anything to that, Elaine?
I think that was a great response. I think following the lead of the family is important, but they can also be in a very delicate place. And so I agree that directing people towards prevention, hope, healing, and feel free to call upon any of us, because we have loss survivors who are well into their journey of healing. That could be sort of that sidebar, could perhaps be the story, instead of entering into the lives of people in their very raw moments after a suicide death, when they may not be thinking clearly or ready to, whatever they share may not be something that they would necessarily share a year down the road. So I would suggest feel free to use any of us as sort of a touchstone to say, what do you think about this? And that happens all the time. And if you want a story with lived experience, we can provide that. A safe story.
you. Another question that we have is, for the example of a student shooting another student and then killing themselves, that's something we would have to cover, obviously, as a news outlet. Given that, what additional information or voices would you recommend we look to include in a story like that?
Great question. I thought a lot about that particular headline, and I thought it's factual. It is. So I think I'm going to try to answer this question, and then one of the first questions, which is, if you do have to report, you have to give details, location, etc. Is there a way to do that it doesn't create the headline and the drama, but you get it embedded in the article where it's still there, it's factual, and then you bring in, what are the resources on that in that setting, or what resources exist in the state that you can direct people to. So the story, just like the one about CDC says suicide is on the rise, that didn't become the headline. That became, oh, by the way, suicide is on the rise nationally, but this is what we're doing in our community. Once again, if you can think about where the story begins and ends, and add that information in a way that it doesn't become the prominent draw me to this sensational scene and details, but trying to kind of diverse it as part of the story, but not the headline and not the takeaway messages. Really the skill that we appreciate you bringing to your work. And we're happy to, to help respond to some of those things if you want any sort of questions about how does this read or how does this look kind of thing. I invite Mary or Kim or Russ to feel free to chime in on that.
So I'll just add a couple of additional comments because I couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, this has become a fairly regular, thing in the news media, and there's a whole bunch of issues outside of that having to do with mental health and a lot of other things in the country. But I think, what I see for a balance is a lot of reporting on that, that goes to, mention, what the victims were doing and what the organizations were doing and how they, interacted with the community. And I think those things are important to address also, but also realizing that I don't think there's any way that you cannot, accurately report on these things. But there does have to be that balance. And I think this is one area where I think law enforcement is spending a lot of time because they realize what they're going to get in the middle of. They realize how it affects communities, how it affects how the trust between law enforcement and communities. So bridging each gap, assuring that you have services there immediately to stop the loss of life, but also realizing that there's all these other things that will come out after. And if, I don't think there's been many of these incidents where the person was not suicidal, the person that committed the act. So I think it's worth mentioning the mental health aspects. I'm seeing that more now than we did in the last few years. And I think that's important to recognize. And I think the other thing to recognize is how far, we need to go. We've come a long way, but it's obvious that we need to go farther. And in controlling these events, it will be a community effort along with law enforcement, along with the media. And I think that's how we're going to see, significant change. And I think there's a lot of communities after the fact, that move in those directions. Because the tragedy of it, how do you explain that? It's hard for any of us to comprehend it. But I think there is some other things that are happening now that lead me to believe that I think people are trying to, wrap their heads around this thing and come up with solutions. So, and I think, again, I think the media and journalists are going to be a huge part of that.
One thing that I've noticed, because we've had so many mass shootings so tragically, is the media has moved away from spending a lot of time on the shooter and giving them notoriety, and really moving away towards looking at, as Russ said, the victims and healing and the trauma, support that people can get if they've been affected by that. So that's just another way to turn that angle away from giving attention, notoriety, and perhaps appeal to the shooter, through the the profile of the shooter and really giving the attention to the people who've been affected and how can we help those suffering from these kinds of incidents.
Thank you. I have one last question here, which is on the theme of trauma, and that is, how would you recommend journalists care for themselves in the process of reporting on a suicide death?
We all care deeply about that issue and thought about it a lot before we put this program together. I'll turn to my colleagues to see if any of you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I will tell you that when I heard about doing this and talking with all you great people on the call, that was the first thing that came to mind, because I could tell you that some of the reasons that we started training with law enforcement officers were fairly, we're centered on first responders themselves. Because I can tell you from personal experience and from many, many colleagues, how those things affect people in the business. Now, I also know this, nobody gets a pass. And I have been around and been in enough scenes for many years to know that the journalists know everything that I know. They're there many times. They even go beyond and end up talking to family members and talking to communities. And that may be somebody that I didn't have contact with. And you would be, you'd be remiss to not really recognize how much that affects you. So one of the things I wanted to come out of today was, and I'm so glad somebody asked the question, was, we have to take care of ourselves. And in a lot of ways, we're all in the same business. Whether you're responding to it or you're reporting it, we're all there. We're all first responders in this. And I think we have to recognize that there is no way you can hear some of the details or recognize, what these traumatic events are with families and communities and not come away affected. It's impossible. And I think we all have responsibility to each other and to ourselves to take part in some form, of recovery from them. There's in law enforcement, first responders, we do some debriefings that would certainly be something that the media can participate in, or just being able to talk to somebody. For many, many years, first responders didn't do that well. And I can give you a long list of casualties from the professions. And I think that is really, that can affect anybody. And I'm not speaking, I've never been a journalist, but I am sure there's journalists that can recall distinctly, some of the traumatic events that have happened that you reported on and that you were part of with, in company with first responders. So I think it's got to be, as it is, a team effort to change how we report and how we look, to be very cognizant of the fact that we can affect the community and how we report this and how we look at it. We have to also understand that it's time to take a much better look at ourselves and assure that we're doing, the best that we can to take care of ourselves, and using some of those mental health assets that have now become part of community assets. So it's a wonderful question. I'm glad it came up, and thank you for letting me chime in on it.
Elaine and Mary, would you like to add to that?
I would. I'm having a little bit of an allergy attack right now, but yeah, I think that self-care is really important in the work that we all do. I think, taking a break, walking away from it, talking to a colleague, if you get a chance to debrief in your structure of work, talking about it with somebody does help. Just acknowledging that it affects you. Don't suppress it. And actually, I'd like to say that 988 is available for anybody to call at any time. And so if you're a journalist and you just feel like you need to talk to somebody, you can call 988, and actually would be beneficial to 988 to hear from different industries to say, this affected me, I'm covering this. How can you help me? Can you just talk to me for a minute and walk me through that? I think that could be really beneficial. And then just take a breath, go for a walk, get some fresh air, break yourself from that, because you can get really down a rabbit hole in this stuff and it can really affect you and you don't even realize it. So being intentional, if you're covering a story like that, maybe have a coworker that you can, share the story with and have them, talk back and forth with you, safe messages, safe language, all of that, that can help you. If you're going to have to cover something of tragedy and you have those tools there, you can walk through that together and it'll make you feel like you've done a good job, and then you can relax and take a deep breath. But it's that ripple effect that affects everybody.
I hear Russ speaking about law enforcement and thinking about years ago, they didn't ask for help and they were probably taught not to. It was not part of the, and it was actually quite something that you just didn't do. It was quite stigmatized to ask for help. And now that's very, very different now. And there's different professions that are starting to come forward and realizing we need this too. It's not just the help that we provide to others or the work that we do out there. It's the way it affects us. And so we would ask you to do the same thing that we're asking you to promote, which is these mental health resources are effective. They're available, and take advantage of those, as well as some of the natural things that work for you. Peer support, friends, supportive family, and maybe even your pets. Have something, so your own little reservoir of where do I go after I've been to a really tough scene, and can come home and just kind of, what do I need? And I know one person said she would pull into the driveway and just sit in the car for a few minutes because I didn't want to just walk into the house and, just change, gears very quickly. I just needed some time to transition. So it's a lot of little tools and tips and things that have worked for you in the before that can be part of your repertoire, really about, the routine, making it part of your health routine, just like you take vitamins in the morning, and maybe, do some exercise during the day. It could be part of your mental health routine.
Thank you all so much for those thoughtful responses. That concludes our questions that have come in. So I invite you, Elaine, and others to move on to any last minute resources you'd like to share before we close out for the day.
So all of us can really appreciate the partnership. As we were working on this, thought if there are other areas that the media would be interested in, we might be able to bring expertise forward to talk about future lunch and learns. We actually, vicarious trauma is one of them, and that certainly just came up. So we can talk about a lot of different things that are going on in New Hampshire, both initiatives, as well as, what is your role and what's the effect on your role in responding to traumatic scenes, as well as what are the resources out there and the other things that we can bring in to help promote a story and promote resources, including many people with lived experience. We have speakers bureaus that can be part of any kind of media efforts that are going on to promote help and healing. And here are some of the resources that we will also share with you in the chat box. And here is our contact, the primary contact information that you can feel free to reach out and follow up with any of us, certainly. But Mary and I thought we'd simplify that and put our own contact information up there for you. We are very grateful to Melanie and to Laura for this opportunity. We hope that it's the beginning of a dialogue and also one that we can be available to on when you need us. We want to be there. So by all means, keep us on your short list.
Well, we want to thank you so much for all this great information and for your time and efforts. And I want to thank the folks who came today. There will be, we'll make the recording available to everyone, and we'll also provide the resources that were in the chat today. So you'll be getting a whole bunch of goodies in your inbox following this, and that we hope you'll share with your newsrooms and colleagues. So thank you so much. Anyone else have anything, Laura or anybody?
I'll
Russ
add my
and
thanks.
Mary, Russ and Mary, we realized if you wanted to say anything about the SPC
I'm so sorry.
communications. Yep.
Yes.
Sure, I'll start. So first, what an opportunity, and thank you for having us again. And I think as far as the SBC goes, these are some of the things that we're striving, to close some gaps on, and that is have better communications with the media and assure that we're moving in the same direction. So the one thing that I can speak very proudly of is the SBC is just made up of a tremendous amount of professionals from different organizations that add a flavor to the overall SBC that really, you know, all the disciplines are there. And I hope this is something that we started that is just one more part of SBC growing in the right direction, and the people that are there having the ability to interact better with the communities and with professionals like yourselves. So happy about it. You know, we'll do the best certainly we can to make sure that it's sustainable and to make sure that we follow up, you know, with other presentations when given the opportunity. So thank you.
That was pretty short for you, Russ. I'm proud of you. So this is all about communications. So I'm, you know, obviously the communications committee is all in on this and would love to work with the media outlets and journalists. And one thing that did come up that I'll follow up with you is your journalist standards. And I would love to see what those are, because I think that would be a real fun thing to take a look at those and how we can offer some kind of support to that, and for us to also understand that. And for those that are wondering why certain stories get in, if we can take a look at that, I think that would be a really good exercise for the future for the communications group. But we do have amazing subcommittees that are working on this all through the state, and amazing partners on the full council. So thank you for giving us this opportunity. And if you want to know any more information or want to be part of the communication subcommittee, we're always looking for new people. We would welcome a journalist to join us. And thank you.
And there'll be a big media event in the fall, correct, Mary, for Suicide Prevention Awareness Week?
There will
will
be, they'll be in September, and we'll have a press conference and a lot of media, social media going out about that. And we'd love you guys to watch out for that and help us promote that throughout the state of New Hampshire. Our conference that comes up every November is something else that we will be promoting and featuring stories of lived experience, you know, through the summer and into the fall, leading up to that.
Terrific. We're going to close out today's webinar. Thank you all for being here as guests. Thank you to our presenters and to NAMI New Hampshire, and to our co-host, the Granite State News Collaborative, and Melanie. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.